Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about something that's probably given you a headache or two in web design: building complex two-dimensional layouts. We're breaking down the tool that finally makes it easy, CSS Grid. It's a system that truly revolutionizes how we think about laying out a web page.
Okay, so here's the game plan. First, we'll get into what CSS Grid actually is and why it's such a big deal. Then, we'll look at its anatomy, the building blocks. After that, we'll build our very first grid and learn how to position things exactly where we want them. And finally, we'll tackle the big question: Grid or Flexbox? When do you use which one?
You know the feeling, right? You're wrestling with floats, trying to get all your positioning just right, and it feels like you're fighting the browser every step of the way. You just want two things to line up, but nope. Well, CSS Grid is here to end that struggle.
So let's start with the absolute basics. What is this thing that promises to make our lives so much easier? Let's meet the hero of our story. Now, the key word here, the one you really need to remember, is two-dimensional. See, most other methods, even the super useful Flexbox, are one-dimensional. They think in terms of either a row or a column. But Grid was built from the ground up to handle both at the same time. And that, right there, is its superpower.
All right, to really master Grid, we've got to learn the lingo. The terms might sound a little weird at first, but I promise, once it clicks, it all makes perfect sense. So let's break down the essential pieces.
First up is the grid container. Think of this as the mainframe, the blueprint for your whole layout. It's the one element where you basically say, "Hey browser, everything inside me is now going to play by grid rules."
And what lives inside the container? The grid items. These are your building blocks, your content, your images, your buttons. As soon as you declare a container, any direct child element automatically becomes a grid item, ready to be placed. Simple enough, right?
Next, grid tracks. Don't let the name intimidate you. It's really just a fancy way of saying your rows and columns. When you define how many columns you want, you're creating the tracks for your items to sit in.
And this is where things get really cool. The grid lines are the invisible lines that separate your rows and columns. They're like coordinates on a map, giving you pinpoint control to tell an item exactly where to start and where to end.
And check this out. The numbering system is so smart. If you have 3 columns, you have 4 vertical lines. You can count them from the start: 1, 2, 3, 4. Or, and this is the really clever part, you can count from the end using negative numbers. So -1 is always the very last line, no matter how many columns you have. This is a lifesaver for responsive designs.
Okay, and now for the theory. We've got the vocabulary down. Now let's get our hands dirty and actually build something. You're about to see just how easy it is to get a grid up and running.
Honestly, it all comes down to this. You turn on the grid with Display Grid, and then you tell it how many columns you want. That's it. That gets you 90% of the way there for a basic layout. Everything else is just fine-tuning.
And this, right here, illustrates the magic of the FR unit. It stands for fractional unit. Instead of saying, make each column 200 pixels wide, which is super rigid, you say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. That tells the browser, take all the available space and divide it into 3 equal fractions. The columns just automatically grow and shrink. It's an absolute game changer.
And hey, here's a little pro tip to make your code look much cleaner, especially if you're making a big 12-column grid or something. Instead of typing 1FR 12 times, you can just use the repeat function. It's easier to read and way easier to update later. Okay, now for the really fun part. We've made a nice uniform grid, but what about those amazing asymmetrical bento box layouts you see all over the web these days? Let's see how we can break out of that simple box structure.
So, when you first create a grid, it's pretty orderly. Every item just slots itself neatly into the next available cell. It's clean for sure, but maybe a little boring.
But watch what happens with just one single line of CSS. We tell the first item, grid column, span 2, and bam, it stretches across 2 columns. And look, the browser is smart enough to just reflow every other item perfectly around it. This span command is the secret sauce. You can do grid row span 2 to make something taller, or combine them to make a big feature block. This is how you build those really beautiful dynamic designs.
All right, it's time to address the elephant in the room: Grid versus Flexbox. This confuses a lot of people, but it's actually pretty simple once you know their core purpose. They're both amazing, but they're built for different jobs. So here's the bottom line. Use Flexbox for one-dimensional layouts. It's perfect for arranging things in a single line, like the items in your navigation bar or content inside a card.
Use Grid for the big picture, the two-dimensional structure of your entire page. But here's the real secret. They're not competitors. They're a team. You'll often use Flexbox inside of a Grid item.
And there you have it. We've gone through the what, the why, and the how of CSS Grid. You now have the tools to finally ditch those old, frustrating layout hacks and start building powerful, modern, and truly responsive websites. The power is at your fingertips. So the only question is, what amazing layout are you going to build first?